Some years don't quite define themselves. They're not the beginning of something or the end of something. They're the moment, just before everything shifts. 1988 was one of those years. The pieces on the global board were moving, but they hadn't yet settled into their new positions. The Cold War was still there, though without the same frozen rigidity it had carried at the start of the decade. Some boundaries were beginning to give. Some ideas that had seemed immovable were starting to show cracks. And meanwhile, the world did what it always does. It lived, competed, suffered, created, and entertained itself without quite knowing what was coming. Mikhail Gorbachev had been leading the Soviet Union for 3 years, and it was already clear that something had changed inside a system that for decades had appeared monolithic. Perestroika, his program of economic restructuring, and glasnost, which pushed for greater openness and transparency in public life, were not simple administrative tweaks. They were signals that Soviet leadership was acknowledging the model had deep problems. In 1988, Gorbachev went further. He announced unilateral cuts to Soviet armed forces and addressed the United Nations General Assembly with a vision of international order built on cooperation rather than confrontation. Those were words that would have sounded impossible 10 years earlier. At the same time, the war in Afghanistan was reaching a breaking point. After nearly a decade of Soviet intervention, with an enormous human cost and no clear victories, the Geneva Accords signed in April 1988 opened the path for a troop withdrawal. It wasn't a peace treaty between all the parties involved. It was an agreement between Pakistan and Afghanistan, backed by both superpowers. Soviet forces began pulling out. That withdrawal, which would be completed in early 1989, carried its own symbolic weight. The Soviet Union was acknowledging it could not sustain that effort indefinitely. For many analysts at the time, it was one of the first concrete signs that the global balance of power was shifting. While all of this was unfolding geopolitically, the planet gathered in Seoul for the Summer Olympics. South Korea had been devastated by war in the 1950s and had spent decades under military dictatorship. In 1988, the country hosted the Games for the first time in its history and used them as a showcase to the world. It was a demonstration of a remarkable economic transformation and of a society that had taken real steps toward democratization in the months leading up to the event. The Seoul Games were also the most inclusive up to that point in terms of participating countries. Most of the world showed up together, including the Soviet Union and the United States, which had boycotted each other's games in 1980 and 1984. On the athletics track, Florence Griffith Joyner, known as Flo Jo, dominated the sprinting events with a style all her own and set world records in the 100 and 200 meters that still stand today. But the image that burned itself into memory wasn't hers. It was Ben Johnson's. The Canadian sprinter of Jamaican descent crossed the finish line in the 100 meters with a time that seemed almost impossible. 3 days later, he tested positive for stanozolol. His gold medal was stripped. It became one of the most resonant sports scandals of the 20th century, not only because it involved one of the most watched events in track and field, but because it forced an uncomfortable conversation about how far the use of performance-enhancing substances had spread in elite sport. The year also had its tragedies, and they deserve to be named without sensationalism. In July, the American guided missile cruiser USS Vincennes shot down a civilian Iranian aircraft, Iran Air Flight 655, over the Persian Gulf. All 290 people on board were killed. The incident took place in the context of the long and devastating war between Iran and Iraq, which in August of that same year reached a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. That conflict, which had started in 1980, had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and left both societies exhausted. The ceasefire didn't resolve anything at its roots, but it stopped the machinery of destruction. In December, a Pan-American Airlines flight traveling from London to New York exploded in mid-air over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. All 259 people on board were killed, along with 11 residents of the town who died when debris fell on them. It was the deadliest terrorist attack on British soil up to that point. Investigations would eventually point toward Libya, but in 1988, the world absorbed the blow with a mixture of grief, disbelief, and an unanswered question. Who, why, and how was this possible? That same December, a powerful earthquake struck the Soviet Republic of Armenia. The cities of Spitak and Leninaken were destroyed. Estimates of the death toll ranged between 25,000 and 50,000 people. It was a catastrophe that exposed serious weaknesses in Soviet infrastructure and forced Gorbachev to cut short an official visit to the United States and return home immediately. In an unprecedented gesture, the Soviet Union accepted international humanitarian aid. That, too, was a sign of the times. In Latin America, 1988 brought a politically significant moment. Chile had lived under Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship since 1973. That year, under the regime's own rules, a referendum was held to decide whether Pinochet would remain in power for another 8 years. The no vote won with 55%. It wasn't the immediate end of the dictatorship, but it was the beginning of the process that would lead the country toward democratic elections. It was a victory won at the ballot box, at a moment when many doubted it was even possible. On the other side of the world, in Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto became prime minister in December, the first woman to lead a government in a majority Muslim country. The daughter of former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who had been executed by a military dictatorship years earlier, she returned from exile, led the Pakistan People's Party, and won the election. Her rise to power was seen across much of the world as a historic opening. In Burma that same year, the picture was entirely different. A massive popular uprising against the military junta was violently suppressed in August and September. Thousands of people took to the streets. Many were killed or imprisoned. The movement was crushed, though it left behind figures and names that would continue to resonate in the years ahead. On the scientific and technological front, 1988 left behind signals that seemed marginal at the time and turned out to be enormous. In November, a graduate student named Robert Tappan Morris released, accidentally according to his own account, a program that spread through computer networks connected to ARPANET, the direct predecessor of the Internet. The Morris worm, as it came to be known, infected thousands of university and government computers and severely slowed the network. It was one of the first large-scale cybersecurity incidents in history. The idea that networks could be vulnerable in that way was new. Many people were still barely beginning to understand what those networks even were. That same year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was established by the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization. Its mission was to gather and synthesize scientific evidence on global warming and present it to governments. In 1988, the issue wasn't on the public agenda the way it would be decades later, but the creation of the panel signaled that within the scientific community, the concern was real and growing. And in bookstores around the world, Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time became an unexpected phenomenon. A book about cosmology, black holes, and the origins of the universe that reached a general audience and stayed on bestseller lists for years. The pop culture of 1988 had its own rhythm. In cinemas, Rain Man, with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, explored the relationship between two very different brothers and won the Oscar for Best Picture. Die Hard turned Bruce Willis into an action star with a formula the genre kept recycling for years. Beetlejuice brought Tim Burton to mainstream audiences. Who Framed Roger Rabbit blended animation and live action in a way that left an entire generation genuinely amazed. In music, videos were still the dominant format for consuming songs. Walkmans filled subways and parks, and the video rental store on a Friday night was a family ritual. Entertainment was consumed on cassette tapes, cathode ray screens, and FM radio. The globalization of culture was moving fast, even if nobody had that word for it yet. 1988 is not usually remembered as the year everything changed. That title belongs to 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything that came with it. But the year before was full of signals. Gorbachev reforming from within. Afghanistan ending in a way nobody quite celebrated. South Korea presenting itself to the world. Doping exposing the shadows behind elite sport. Lockerbie reminding everyone that violence gives no warning. Armenia showing that the Soviet bloc could bleed too. Chile voting against a dictatorship with a ballot. A woman reaching power in Pakistan. A computer network compromised for the first time at scale. Climate entering the scientific agenda. All of that happened in a single year. Major transformations almost never arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly first, in the shape of news stories that seem unconnected and aren't. 1988 was exactly that. The year the world began to move, before anyone could hear the sound of the brake.